So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen, and I just have a PowerPoint first that I just kind of wanted to go through to kind of help guide the conversation, and then glad to take any questions. And since it is a smaller group, if there are questions as we go along, if you see them pop up, feel free to interrupt me. I'm glad to stop as we go through, as we're talking about a specific part. So I'm going to start here. Okay, I'm sharing ethics in a digital age. I just wanted to kind of start by first pointing out, in addition to my work as a journalist, I am also the current chair for the ethics chair for the Society of Professional Journalists, also known as SPJ. Our code is probably one of the most widely used, not only in the US, but also across around the world. So there's just a link to the code. There are other codes and obviously more guidance depending on if you work in broadcast or you work primarily in social media. But the SPJ code is the one that tends to be the most broadly used and one that a lot of journalists do learn when they go to school. So here's what it looks like if you've seen it. It's divided into 4 parts. We call them 4 tenets. The first one of those tenets is seek truth and report it. Then you have minimize harm, act independently, and be accountable and transparent. And I'll talk briefly through some of those points, some of those tenets right now. So first, seek truth and report it. I think this one is probably one that most people are familiar with, and we don't have too many questions that arrive from this. So part of my role at SPJ, we have an ethics hotline, and I receive questions from journalists and also from the public, just people asking, if it's a journalist, I'm in this situation, should I show this photo? Should I name this person? If I don't name them, how should I approach it? From the public, I get questions about, this journalist did this, is this ethical? And most of those questions that I receive are actually from the minimize harm part of the code. And I think when we talk about it, you may understand why. But seek truth and report it basically just says, our goal as journalists is to find out the truth and report the truth. That is part of our role to society. A couple things that come into play during that time is remembering that speed nor format excuses inaccuracy. So we see this a lot when journalists started reporting on social media or reporting online, that sometimes things would be reported incorrectly. And people would say, oh, it was just on Twitter, or it's just on Facebook, or it was just on our web story. Well, we believe you should always seek truth and report it, and it's better to be accurate than to be first. Also under this, we talk about the importance of updating and correcting information through the life of the story, which I'm going to give some examples of that, because in the digital age, that is so, so important, and there are lots of questions that come up around that. And then also seeking truth and report it, like how can you provide access to source material? So can you link to a court document in your web story? Can you provide the link to a lawsuit so that people can review it themselves? And in a digital age, this is something that is even more accessible and easy to do. So that's seek truth and report it. The next one is minimize harm. And again, I said this is where we get the most questions, and it's because as journalists, unfortunately, when you're publishing information, there's probably always some sort of harm that's going to be caused, right? And what our goal is, we have a role to provide information to the public. So while we're doing that, how can we minimize the harm that is caused, whether to an individual, to a business, to an organization? We always want to try to balance the public's right to know with the amount of harm that could be caused. And so when you're thinking about minimize harm, things to think about, there's a difference between someone who might be a private citizen versus a public figure. A public figure could be someone who puts themselves in the spotlight as an entertainer, as an influencer on social media, as a YouTuber, or it could be a politician, right? You have someone that actually is an elected official. And so those are kind of 2 differences when you're looking at, oh, should I publish this information? Well, one question we always first ask is, well, what type of person is this? Is it a public or a private? And that can determine that could help determine whether or not you may publish the information. Also under minimize harm, and we get this question a lot. realizing that, well, yes, it may be legal to publish certain information. That doesn't always mean that it is ethical. So what is legal is not always ethical. And that is something that you really have to think of. So when sometimes people ask me, well, something we've been debating here in the US recently is, should we publish the photos of the protesters? And some protesters are criticizing journalists, saying that, you should not be publishing our photos. And legally, journalists, there really isn't a question. There really isn't that right to privacy. But ethically, are there things that we should think about? And those are conversations that we're having a lot in the US here right now with the protest. The other thing with minimize harm, especially in a digital age, is considering the long-term implications of publication. So before the internet and before things were published digitally, something might end up in a newspaper, and in order to see it, you'd have to go to a library or some archives, and it was really kind of difficult unless you saw it maybe that day or that week. Well, now things live online forever. And so maybe if that, an example that I like to give is if a college student is caught urinating in public and they get a drunken disorderly, right? Like some kind of just kind of minor charge on their campus. A school newspaper may decide, okay, that's a story. And I'm not saying that it's not, but when you publish it nowadays, now when someone Googles that individual's name, is that what's always going to pop up? And is that going to prevent them from getting a job down the line? Is that going to prevent them from getting a date down the line? I mean, there are all these kind of different things that could happen. So then is that story really worthwhile in that same sense? So that's seek truth and report it and minimize harm. Then we have act independently. And the goal here is really to try to, how are you acting independently from advertisers? So something that comes up in the digital age, how are you distinguishing news from advertising, and prominently labeling them on all platforms? So putting the word opinion on your website, making sure that that label follows when someone shares it on Twitter, when someone shares it on Facebook, when someone puts it on Instagram. And then also, we have these hybrid kind of sponsored content. Well, what does that mean and how is that labeled? So making sure that you are acting independently from where the money comes from. And then we have be accountable and transparent. And here we're talking a little bit about conflicts of interest. If you have a conflict with someone you're reporting on, making sure you're disclosing those conflicts and talking about that. Something when we talk about conflicts of interest, we talk about the fact that there might be real conflicts, but then sometimes it's just the perception of a conflict that can be just as bad. So for example, if you're covering a politician and you've donated money to them, do I think that you potentially could still, as a journalist, cover them fairly? Absolutely. I think that's possible. Not always, but I think it is for some people. But because you have donated to that politician, your work, if you are covering that campaign, may be seen as biased because of that donation. So it's that perception of the conflict that can be just as dangerous and just as harmful to your reporting. Under be accountable and transparent, we also talk about exposing unethical conduct in journalism, including within your own organization, meaning if you see unethical conduct going on, maybe you're seeing people pay the people they're interviewing, or you are seeing people alter images and then use them and not disclose that the images are altered. So how can you expose that both internally and then more broadly in the journalism industry? So that is the code of ethics. And if you kind of want more information, we have with each of those tenets, we have basically different links to blog posts, case studies that you can kind of dig in a little deeper. And the whole idea with this code is it is meant to be looked at holistically. So when you are faced with an ethical dilemma and you're trying to figure out what to do, you don't just want to consider the minimize harm part separately from the seek truth and report it. You want to consider the whole document together as one, so that you are looking at everything holistically and making decisions based on each of the tenets instead of just one of them. So again, I think something that I just like to kind of make sure people do understand as journalists, like what's the harm, right? That's something that maybe people ask, like, why does it matter if you just show up at a crime scene and just tweet a photo without really looking at the details? Well, the issue is, again, is that sharing information potentially can always cause some type of harm. So journalism is always usually going to cause some level of harm. Our goal, being ethical journalists, is to try to minimize that harm as much as possible while still fulfilling the role of giving people the accurate information they need to live their daily lives and make decisions about their daily lives. So sometimes when I talk about this, I like to tell people, like, don't let this scare you away. It is sometimes complicated to think about these things, and it's never easy. You may be sitting and having a discussion with 5, 6 different journalists, and everyone might have 5 or 6 different opinions. So you have to decide what's the best way to move forward, knowing that you may not always make everyone happy. And that's kind of the reality. We're not here as journalists to make people happy about the information they're reading. We're here to give them the information they need that is accurate and reflects the reality of the world that they live in. So don't be afraid, even though it seems a little maybe hard. But just be responsible. And if you're responsible and think through these things, I do think that you can be fair and be ethical to not only yourself and for your publication, but also to the community that you serve. So when we're looking at the code of ethics and we're thinking holistically, remember, you're thinking of the whole code holistically. Some things to think about if you're like, okay, I don't know if I should publish this, or, you're kind of unsure of something. Try something. These are just some tips to basically kind of help you as you walk through this. Try putting yourself in your sources or subject's position. So if you have a quote or you have a piece of information that might be very personal about someone, and you're unsure if it needs to be included, I always tried to put myself in that person's position, just as a way to see from their point of view what they may think about it. The other thing is thinking about whether you're causing harm while reporting. Again, you are probably always going to cause some kind of harm. Does that harm outweigh the public's right to know? So this question, is the harm caused by the pursuit of information worth the value of the information to the public's interest? Basically kind of think of it as an equation, and whichever side outweighs the other, that's the direction you should go into. The other thing that I really think that, I don't know, maybe we don't value enough, if you're writing a story and you're really deciding, okay, like, should I use this person's name? Should I use this quote? Should I publish this piece of information from the lawsuit? Any of those types of questions that might come up. If you find that you are losing sleep, or that it just doesn't feel right, like, trust that gut decision. And to me, that says it's at least worth having another conversation. It's at least worth bringing other people in from the newsroom into the conversation as you think about this and decide what to do. Personally, I think, I tend to be more cautious when it comes to these ethical decisions. And the reason being, I think, is because you can always publish more. What's harder is to remove and or take back content that has been published. Yes, you can remove a story, but again, especially online and on social media, things don't go away. So someone has that screen grab somewhere, and who knows what they can do with it after they have it. And other things to think about when you're thinking of kind of ethical decisions, think about who will receive this information. Again, you're putting yourself kind of in the sources position. Yes, you have readers, viewers in your community, but also think about that family, the sources or the subject's family, friends, children, all of that. How will people on the receiving end of this information be influenced, and what may they do with it? The what may they do with it is really important. There are countless situations where a journalist has published information, and then the public, and again, it normally is a minority of the public, ends up doing something with the information that puts the individual in harm's way or in danger. So let's say you publish an argument that is being said about the protests, the people participating in the public protest here is, what if you publish, some people are afraid of losing their job for protesting for Black Lives Matters or for talking about defunding a police department. So if their photo is published and then they lose their job, again, that's not your fault that they lost the job, but that's an outcome of what someone else did with the information that you provided them. In other cases, people have revealed sources and or victims' names, and then those victims have then been stalked, have had their information, personal information posted online. And again, that's not something that you caused, but by providing the identity of the individual, that's what people did with it. So I think that's something to always think about, what may be done with the information that you are providing. And then also, what is again, the consequence of this story being on my organization's website? Even if you take it down, which we're going to talk about that question, it doesn't mean that it is gone. People take screen grabs, there's the archive, people are always saving things. So now we're going to go through some ethical dilemmas. Before I do that, are there any questions just about the code in general? And I'll kind of stop sharing really quickly. Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can, yes.
You talked about the dilemma between showing protesters' faces and the consequences to that. I mean, can you elaborate a little bit about that? Because it's a really it's a huge dilemma. And how do you come in terms with this conflicting interests?
Yeah, so here in the US, the protests for the most part have happened on public property. So here, legally, totally fine to take a photo and to print it. People are on public property, they don't have the right to privacy. So I think first when you look—
It's same here, by the way.
Okay. And so I think one thing that we're seeing here is, one, I don't think that protesters and maybe the general public understand that their right to privacy ends when they're on public property. So something that I've suggested and SPJ has suggested is, can we engage and do a little media literacy, personal rights literacy, whatever it may be? I think that would go a long way, because what we have seen is members of the protesters will say, you don't have a right to take my photo. And it's like, well, actually we do. And you hate to come off that way because it's like just kind of telling them they're wrong. But I think that's part of the issue that we see here in the US. But besides that, when you look at the ethical dilemma, my advice has been, I think you take the photos and then you can decide what to do with them later, right? And are there ways that you can minimize that harm while you are there? So maybe can you ask permission, right, to use the photo? Again, that's not always possible, but in some cases, I know there was a photographer on a panel with me recently from the Los Angeles Times, and he said he gets permission from everyone before they publish an image. And if they can't get permission, then it has to be a really powerful image for them in order to use it. The other thing is okay, if you've had protesters come up to you and say, hey, I really would rather not be photographed. Okay, so when there are hundreds and thousands of people there, can you get a similar image by moving to maybe a different side of the protest, by being around others who haven't said that? So there are all kind of things to consider along the way. Now, again, do we need their permission to publish? No, not necessarily, but I think that we can be more ethical and understanding by maybe thinking about these things, potentially asking and getting permission where possible, and thinking also of where the image goes. So if you weren't able to get permission from an individual, but then it's your lead image on your website for every single story, that then when someone shares it on Facebook or shares it on Twitter, that's going to be the lead image there. Well, could you make sure that maybe it's the image that is that lead image is one where you have gotten permission? Not saying that those other images aren't there, but those are ways to kind of minimize harm. Or is it embedded in the story somewhere? Is it part of a larger slideshow? I mean, there are all kind of things like that that you can think about. Yeah. Are you hearing similar things from people about not wanting their photos taken?
Not necessarily.
No. Okay.
And that doesn't apply to live broadcast, you know.
Well, yes. So that's a good point. So live broadcast, I know coming from a television background, I've been watching a lot of the protest, like I was watching a lot of the protest from like what CNN was doing and what the reporters and or anchors were showing from like, they have a video that's just, you know, it's live broadcast. And, you know, I saw a lot of things that I think were good, but then in some cases you see one individual getting arrested and like, why do you have to zoom in so close? Like I question that a little bit. Like it's a peaceful arrest, you know, you don't see anything, but yet they're zooming in tight on the individual's face. And I don't know if those things are necessarily something that needs to be done. Again, you can do it, but do we need to see the zoomed in face when there's no really emotion on the face and it's not, I don't know. Those are things that I question and I wonder if it is necessary. Yeah. Okay, if there aren't any other questions, I'll go back to some of the other ethical dilemmas. Let me share my screen again here. Okay, so some other ethical dilemmas in a digital age. So photos. Looking at this photo, this is an example I think about a lot because we are constantly as journalists going to breaking news scenes and kind of when we are expected to do more as journalists. So, you know, yes, you have your deadlines for the 4 o'clock news or for the, you know, the website whenever the story has to be ready. But you also are expected to tweet and post things on Facebook, maybe go live on Instagram, whatever it may be. So one of the first things that people normally tell journalists to do is to take a photo of the scene and then tweet it out. So this would be something that maybe you're sent to a car accident and you take a photo of the scene and you tweet it out. Does anyone see anything wrong with maybe doing that in this case, if you decided to tweet this photo out?
License number.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Okay, so the license plate number. So let me share again really quickly here. Oh shoot, I hope I didn't exit out, and I might have. Hold on, sorry. I might have exited out. Sorry, you're gonna have to bear with me. I did exit out. Sorry, I'm gonna stop my share really quick. So the license plate number, as I pull this up, so the license plate number is the first thing. And why is that important? Well, let's say that you are the person that is showing up on the scene, you take the photo, you tweet it out. Now, maybe if I'm following you, I am now wondering, okay, what if that is my mom? What if I know that's my mom's car? I've now kind of basically told the daughter that their mom was in an accident before anyone else has had an opportunity to. And that's something as a journalist, we really don't want to be the one revealing that someone might have been in a serious accident or something like that before the authorities have had an opportunity to. So that's that kind of any identifiable information. We want to make sure that we are not including in photos like that. So does that mean you don't share the photo? No, it doesn't mean that you don't share the photo. You could also just blur the photo, the license plate really quickly. The other thing in the photo, I don't know if you noticed, but you can see there's a woman's face that you can see. And okay, I found this again, so I'm just gonna pull it up. So let me share again. Did anyone notice that woman's face? Here we go. So see the woman's face like right here. Again, it's not super noticeable, but if I'm seeing this photo tweeted and I'm following you and I'm like, that looks like my friend's car, and oh, that could be my friend. So, you know, is there a way to take a wider shot? Is there a way, maybe do you blur the face of the individual. I mean, those are all kind of things to think about. Again, not that if you don't do it, it's unethical, but it's how are you minimizing that harm? So that's just one example with photos. The next example I have, so let's say this photo of this big storm, right? You have a photo of the waves coming up and someone posted it on Instagram and you're like, oh, I want to take the photo and I want to now put it on the cover of my magazine. So there are obviously there are legal implications that are involved there, right? But ethically, what are things you should be asking before you decide to take a photo from Instagram and put it on the cover of your magazine? So what are some things that you think you would think about?
Royalties?
Royalties. Okay, so yeah, so that would be something that would be more legal, right? Like that, but yes, like is someone going to, so first with the royalties, the question, you know, legally is like, who owns the rights to the photo, right? And so a lot of people assume that if it's posted to someone's Instagram, that that person owns the rights to the photo, but really it's whoever took the photo, not who's in the photo, not who maybe posted or shared the photo. So that's kind of the first thing you would have to figure out, right? Is who took the photo? And once you know that, then it's getting permission, right? Can you get permission for this? The other thing to think about too, when you're moving content from a social platform onto a platform that is not the social platform, so you're moving it from Instagram to like your magazine cover, is you are leaving that platform and leaving their terms of use according to the platform. So some things that I like to tell journalists to do is if you want to share, let's say, an Instagram photo in your TV broadcast, can you, one, have you got permission? So one, did you figure out who took the photo? Did you ask for permission? If they gave you permission, can they sign something? Can you get it verbally? If you're out in the field, can you have them on camera saying, yes, you can use this photo? The other thing then would be if you're showing the photo, to make sure you give credit in any way that you can. And then also, can you show that the image came from Instagram? So what I mean from that is it's not just like copying the image and then sharing it on your screen. You are actually taking a screenshot of it on the Instagram profile, if that makes sense. Same would go for Facebook, Twitter, all of that.
Also, you would like to verify that you're using the right account of the right person and not
Yes.
a fake account or something.
Absolutely. And I also forgot to say, which is probably the most important first thing, which goes to gathering information and accurately reporting it, is the photo real? I mean, that is something that so many people from social media get really kind of, and again, that goes kind of beyond ethics. We should just be doing that and verifying any photo that we haven't taken. But it happens a lot during natural disasters where basically like a photo from a flood from 2 years ago will end up being shared and saying, oh, this just happened today, and it's not, or a car is added, or, you know, whatever it may be. So you want to make sure and verify that it is a valid photo. Okay, I'm going to share again here. Okay, so this next scenario is kind of the whole idea that, you know, everyone has a mobile phone. Everything can be caught on video now because everyone has a smartphone. So a lawyer is walking home and spots 3 police officers arresting a man and decides to record the video and audio of the incident with his phone. And then the lawyer reaches out to you and gives you this video. And so the question is, do you use the video and the audio? So what do you guys think?
Just like an arrest recording.
Yeah.
Regarding what? I mean.
Good questions. Yeah. So the things you're wondering are, okay, before I'm going to use, okay, great, I have video of this arrest and it's officers arresting people. Okay, people are talking about that right now. But to your point, yeah, what is it showing? Who's involved? What's the bigger story, right? Those are kind of some main questions that you're going to want to know.
And do you trust the source that gave you the video?
Is it real? People can alter this. Is it from 2 years ago? Who knows, right? So you're going to verify if it's real. You're going to look at the circumstances, right? So to the point of, you know, it depends what it shows. What do you think would rise to a level of using video like that? Like, what would be something that was depicted that you would make it newsworthy?
In the video? You mean in the video?
Yeah, in the video. Yeah. So you know that it's
police brutality. I don't know.
Okay, great. Yeah, exactly. If maybe the police were using too much force, that might make it newsworthy.
It could be the person, the actual person, if it's any value that this person is being arrested rather than somebody else, or
right.
somebody anonymous.
Absolutely. Who's involved? Is it someone? I mean, what if it's what if it's the mayor that's involved? What if it's a well-known celebrity? Does that change your, you know, if your choice to use the video or not use the video? So let's say you've decided that it's newsworthy for one of those reasons. Maybe it shows the police brutality, or it shows someone that is in a position of power, or maybe celebrity politician. So now that you know it's newsworthy and you think that the public has a right, should know and watch this, so then, and you've verified that it's true, you know that this happened, you've looked at that. So do you use it?
Why not?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, you know, legally you're covered. It's something that I think the questions I get a lot is, you know, for the most part, once you are given information, as long as you did not encourage anyone to break a law in order for them to get it, then you are free to use it. And I think some people are a little uncomfortable with that reality, but legally that's kind of where it stands. And there's a lot of different precedent, you know, here in the US that has been set for that. But then the question is, you know, ethically, what does it show? And also the questions with that are, okay, how much are you going to blur anything out? Are you going to blur any of the faces? Is that necessary? Do you blur the police officers' faces? Do you blur the person getting arrested? Are you going to show the whole video? How are you going to edit the video, right? I mean, in a TV newscast, normally you're probably going to end up only showing maybe 30 seconds. That's a long time, maybe only 15 seconds of the video. So how are you going to decide to cut that and edit that? And then how are you going to explain that to your users that you decided to only show sections of it? There was a TV station here in the United States just last week, on Friday. They aired a story where a correctional officer in a jail was arresting an inmate, so someone that had already been arrested. The person's hands were behind, like tied behind with handcuffs. But the person started kind of running at the correction officer. So the correction officer slammed the person down to the floor, and there's video of all this happening. And so the TV station, they're a local TV station in Ohio, they decided to blur the individual who was arrested, but not blur the officers. And so they knew, and their reasoning for that was because the person that was arrested was in for a very minor traffic violation. So it wasn't a very serious crime. And so they didn't feel like putting this person's face all over the internet for years to come was something that kind of rose to that occasion. But they knew that they were probably going to get questions about, well, why didn't you blur the correction officers' faces? And so they decided to explain that because those correction officers are in a position of power, that they were not blurring their faces, but they were blurring the face of the individual because it was a minor infraction. And they didn't feel like, while watching the video that they had, that the force was necessary watching it. They felt like the public should see this. So I thought that was really an interesting thing, where they could have blurred both faces. They could have not blurred anyone's faces. But the way they decided was something that needed an explanation. So I think that's a good point to point out when you're making these decisions, to try to always explain why you're making the decisions so that the public knows.
But how can you tell the sequence of the events? I mean, who started this and why?
So
because when we see this video, we have only a clip of the sequel.
Right. So that's a good point. So I think, we hopefully, I would really hope, I think, if as the journalist that you've watched a video all the way through in situations like that from start to finish before kind of taking the pieces that make the most sense, or that you think kind of portray the moment where something goes wrong, or kind of that moment where you see the violence, right? So ideally as a journalist, you've watched the whole video all the way through. The other thing is there are options to put the full video online now, right? So maybe in your TV newscast, you only use 15 seconds, but you can put the whole video on social media or put it online so people can see from start to finish what transpired. Another thing to think about with that is I've seen TV journalists like speed up. So they go to like the start of what the scene is. And then they say, 2 minutes went by, if you've seen that. And then you see kind of the action and they're like, 30 seconds later. And I think that helps. But it can be done poorly in a way that does kind of favor one side or the other, depending on what the situation is. And we do want to be careful of that. Okay, so let's go back to another scenario. So with the same scenario, sorry, there's kind of like a twist. The police charged the lawyer with violating a wiretapping law and aiding prisoner escape and disturbing the peace. So now the question is, do you use the video now? And I think in this case, this makes it more newsworthy potentially, because they're charging someone for videotaping officers, which here in the US is something that is allowable, and you are not helping anyone escape by putting your phone up and recording an incident. In the same case, if maybe the police then tried to take the phone of the lawyer who's recording or anyone else who's recording, I feel like that then makes it almost more newsworthy and more a reason to potentially use the video. So now we have a question, which I think this is something that you talked about when you shared this webinar online or on Twitter. We get asked a lot, can you take a story down? So you publish a story and someone reaches out to you and says, can you please take the story down? I don't know if this has happened to you, but as an investigative journalist, this happened to me all the time when I was leading the investigative team at the NBC station here in San Diego, California. We got asked that question all the time. When we did stories on doctors whose licenses were revoked, meaning they could no longer practice medicine, we got asked often once they got their license back, well, can you please take the story down? And so, questions that I would ask, is, well, has something changed? So in that case, the doctor would say, well, yes, I have my license back. And I would say, okay, so, I will absolutely, if you can, show me that you completed everything you needed to complete and you have your license back, if you can send me that details showing that, I will update the story to reflect that. And then I would ask, okay, can we do a follow-up story on you to talk about how you went through the process of getting your license back? And actually no one took me up on that offer. And I think because they realized, well, that's another story that will pop up when someone Googles their name. But in those cases, we did not take stories down. Yes, something has changed, but if we take the story down, then will anyone ever know that that doctor's license was revoked? Maybe not. A lot of people don't look up on the government websites to see to see the status of a doctor's license, to see if they have different previous charges or anything against them when it comes to their license. So we would decide in those situations to keep the story up. But when you're thinking about this question of, can you take a story down, things to consider is, has something changed? Does the person involved have a change of circumstances? So are they no longer in that position? Have they completed, their sentence and now they would like the story to be updated? Has the court case progressed? This is something that I think journalists don't do a good enough job of. We a lot of times do a good job of covering the initial arrest or the initial charges, but we don't necessarily follow up if a case is dropped, right? We may try with the bigger stories, but not maybe the drunk driving stories or something like that. You also get requests because people say, oh, well, the story is embarrassing. So this happened to me. We did a story on bouncers at like clubs that were like dance clubs that were getting in trouble for being violent with patrons. Either they'd punched people in the face or thrown people to the ground, and people had seriously gotten hurt, and in some cases died. So we did a whole story about this. And one of the bouncers here locally, we did a story. He ended up getting arrested. And when we did the story, someone reached out to us and said, oh my gosh, I just had an incident with this bouncer not too long ago. And we're like, oh, really? Well, what happened? And the guy tells us what happens. And we said, well, would you be willing to talk about it? And he said, sure. So he tells us a story. We do a follow-up TV news story where this guy talks about his interaction with the bouncer and how he got pushed to the ground and had to go to the hospital, all of that. Well, 2 years later, the guy who shared that story with us in the follow-up reaches out and says, hey, like, I know I told you all that stuff, but can you take the story down now? Because I'm having a hard time getting dates. Like when people Google my name, before I go on dates with people, that's what pops up. And I really would just like the story to be taken down. And so he's just embarrassed by it. And so we talked it through, and I was like, well, is any of it untrue? Is there anything that has changed? Is there anything that you told me that was inaccurate? And he's like, no. And I'm like, well, unfortunately, we can't take it down. But in that case, I did try to help him, work on his like LinkedIn profile and to try to tell him, well, if you do these other things with your other social media profiles, that may make the story drop down when it comes to search engine optimization. So those are kind of all different scenarios. You have I'm just embarrassed by the story, I no longer want it up, to, okay, actually the charges have been dropped, something has changed, so can you do something about it? So in the US, I know, and worldwide, this is something that is a growing issue. And the growing issue is that there are laws that will allow for charges to be expunged. So the question is, if the state no longer recognizes the crime, should we and should the publication write? And that's an argument. Like if someone is able to get their crimes to go away from the legal system, why can't they get it to go away from Google? In the EU, they have the right to be forgotten, where information, if it is inaccurate, inadequate, irrelevant, or excessive, people have a right for it to be asked to be removed. And this is just some of these numbers. I'm not sure if you guys have been paying attention to this at all, but Google said it received close to 850,000 requests to remove links since 2014. And this data was relevant up till 2018. So it's a year and a half old now. And they removed 45% of the 3.3 million links that it was asked to scrap. So I think that's kind of interesting how much information is being removed from search engines. And again, even though you remove content, that doesn't necessarily mean it's gone forever, but it can help with people when they're Googling their name. So can you take the story down? We recommend consulting the journalism ethical code, which is ethical journalism should be accurate and fair, minimize harm, valuing the public's need versus harm caused, and being transparent and being accountable. Circumstances matter. If something is factually inaccurate, we absolutely always recommend correcting the story and making sure that the information that's corrected is at the top and that the story reflects that it's been corrected. The New York Times is sometimes bad about this, where they'll do a correction way at the bottom of like a 2,000 word story. And that doesn't really help anyone because a lot of people don't read down past the 2,000 words. So we would always recommend that corrections go at the top or within the story where where the inaccurate information was. If there's outdated information, can you somehow update the information? And or if someone's just uncomfortable or annoyed, or there is an annoyance for people involved, that would be a case where I'm very much less likely to update a story and or take a story down. So possible solutions: you can keep the story online and add a note or update what's needed. You can do a follow-up story. You can delete it. Now, I think I'd be curious to see if your news organizations have deleted stories. The organizations that I have worked with, I have not been a part of a story that has been deleted or had one of my stories deleted. We've updated stories. We've done a follow-up, but we have not just fully deleted stories. Other things that you can do, you can try to basically make it so that it is not cataloged and will show up in search engines. The key with all of this is consistency and transparency are key. So making sure you have consistent policies. A lot of newsrooms I've realized don't have consistent policies, and I think that's problematic. You want to make sure that you do have consistency in your newsroom, and it's not just, oh, well, this manager decides today to take it down. This other manager has decided not to. That's not going to look good for you legally or ethically. And then whatever you decided to do, make sure you're transparent about it, and you do it on every single piece that was shown. So if it was a piece online, did you then also update the Facebook post or reshare on Facebook or reshare on Twitter or in your newscast? So really kind of with that, take a story down, create a process for dealing with it. If you can write it down, be consistent, that's super helpful. Any questions about that? No? Have any of you had to deal with, have any of you had someone who has asked you to remove a story? Yes. Has anyone ever removed a story? It's okay if you have. I'd be curious. I know I've seen stories removed. Yeah. Okay, that's okay. We'll go to the next scenario. But I know in newsrooms I've been in, it's always been a hotly debated topic, and unfortunately lacked consistency for what has been done. Meaning that it seems that 2 weeks ago we did one thing, and then the present day we're doing something different. And I think that's something that I hope we can work to be a little better on about.
Lynn, I have a question.
Yes. Hello, by the way. Good to see you.
Hi, good to see you again. I apologize, I joined in a bit late, so if you addressed it, cut me short. I mean, you're talking about the ethical code of the Society of Professional Journalists. I mean, who is obliged to follow that? And what about other journalists who are not members of the organization?
That is a great question. So I actually didn't hit on that, and so thank you for bringing that up. So SBJ's code is a voluntary code. It is a code that has been produced for journalists. And so originally when the code was produced, journalist was kind of way more easily definable, I would say. It was someone who worked at a newspaper, someone who worked at a TV station, someone who worked at a radio station. Now, we like to say anyone that is committing an act of journalism should think about following a code like this. So that could be anyone sharing information online. It could be anyone that's running a blog. It could be anyone that has a podcast, and maybe they don't consider themselves a journalist, but because they are sharing information in a space where a lot of people could consume it, they could potentially cause harm. So we think they should be thinking about these ethical decisions anytime they're publishing content. Now, so that would mean not just someone working at a newspaper, but someone who might have a podcast or a blog. And I even talk to my friends who share stories on Facebook and post things on Facebook and post their opinions that are not journalists at all, and just say, hey, before you share this about the woman you ran into at the grocery store, like, and you name her, you share her photo, like maybe you should be thinking about these things, because there are implications beyond it when it used to be just telling your friend on the phone, right? That's now potentially going global. A good example of that is, I'm not sure if you heard about the Starbucks barista who here in the US, and it was actually here in San Diego, a woman walked into a Starbucks and refused to put a mask on. So the barista said, I'm sorry, I unfortunately can't serve you. Our rule here is you have to wear a mask. And so she is someone who doesn't believe in wearing a mask. And so she got really upset. She walked out. She decided to walk back in and ask for his name. And she took a photo of him and then posted to her Facebook profile and said, basically, this person didn't, naming the person and showing his face, didn't give me my Starbucks. I'm really upset, like blah, blah, blah. Like basically kind of publicly shaming him. Well, she posted it publicly. It ends up going viral. And someone ended up starting a tip jar for the barista, and he has over $100,000 in tips now. But the whole point of that, though, is that I don't think she really thought about the impact that one post on Facebook could have, whether good or bad, right? She was hoping that it was bad for him. Turns out it ended up being bad for her. But those are the things to think about. So we believe that lots more people that use this code should. That said, it is voluntary. SPJ members do not sign anything saying they are going to follow this. If a journalist decides to not follow something like this and publish information, there's nothing that SPJ can do to get them in trouble or take a license away, because here in the US, we don't have license to be journalists. Yes, you're welcome. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you, I don't know if it's down the road with your presentation, but can you talk a little bit about conflicting interests between the journalist and the publisher or the owner of the media outlet that puts pressure on the journalists, to do something that is not completely ethical in terms of commercial, in terms of, crossing the lines between the distinction between, journalist content and commercial content, and providing some kind of services to the commercial department at the news outlet?
So I think, are you talking like if, so I guess I'm thinking of two situations that I could see happening. One is a journalist being told not to pursue a story, maybe because of an advertiser. Okay. But then I can also think of situations where journalists now are sometimes being asked to write content that is like specifically paid for. So both of those. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. So the first one is, we ethically and with, an SPJ and to be an ethical journalist, we do believe that outside influence, whether that's advertising, that's political influence, that's, your manager's wife works at City Hall, whatever it may be, that should not influence news decisions. Those should be done separately. If something is newsworthy, it should be published, even if those circumstances should not influence that. So if a journalist is faced with that and they really feel strongly that what is being done is unethical, we believe first you should look to your internal guides of what is in your newsroom to voice and raise that concern. A lot of newsrooms will have policies that say, they have a code of a handbook or a code of conduct or their own ethical codes that say, editorial decisions will not be influenced by advertisers. That's a lot of times something that people have. So bring that up then to your manager and say, hey, look, we're actually, by doing this, we are violating. And I would make sure to maybe, include a note to HR or a journalism organization like yours or like SPJ to have that support, right? Because that's something we can do. You can cite our code. You can say, this is something that these professional organizations are against. So we suggest trying to deal with it internally first. Then you have to make the hard decision of, okay, am I going to bring this up externally? And knowing that bringing it up externally may mean that you're going to lose your job. It may mean that you might be out of work for a little bit. I mean, those are kind of the realities. And so we realized at SPJ that while we would want everyone to do that, we also understand that you need to make money to live. You need to, so we understand that doesn't always happen because you have kids at home or whatever it may be. But ideally, that would be the situation. You raise it internally. If it's not solved, raise it externally, and talk openly about what happened and why it's wrong. For the situation of if you are asked to write content that is sponsored and or like specific for an advertiser's needs, ideally in a newsroom, the person who's doing news content and who is writing that sort of content is not the same person. We would highly recommend that those positions are separate and or that it's a separate individual that's hired to do that kind of sponsored content, because that can, let's say if you're the person that's, hosting something for like Wheel of Fortune, that's something that sometimes here in the US you might see someone do. They'll host Wheel of Fortunes in town, but then also now they're doing a story about like a car accident or it doesn't mix well. And so ideally those are two different people. If it's impossible for it to be two different people, can you somehow make sure that the labeling is done properly and or it's explained in the different stories?
Can I follow up on this? I think the decision whether to leave it internally or take it out externally depends on the kind of backing journalists have from an organization, for a union or something, and also from the support of the public. And unfortunately, the public, especially in your country, but also in ours, is incited against the media and the journalists. And so people even gloat when journalists are hit or kicked out of their jobs. So it really highlights the importance of a union or organization that really backs up journalists in such difficult dilemmas.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think right now, unfortunately, in this time, you might not get the public support that maybe you would have in different times. But I think always you will have journalists in the industry support if you are doing what is a founding principle of what we all believe in as an industry. And I think, if you say, if I'm interviewing you and you said you had to walk away from a job because they were letting advertisers decide what was published and you gave me an example, I'm not going to hold that against you. If anything, I kind of value and know that you have thought about this ethical conduct more because you've been willing to talk about it and bring it up. But I think you're right. I think with the public, if you're thinking the public's going to feel sorry for you or, kind of be on your side, I think unfortunately right now, you're going to have some people that will, but I don't know that the majority would be. So I have another ethical dilemma here. I'm going to share my screen again. So can you share the document you're referring to? So this happens maybe a lot with, let's say you get information from a source or you are provided with an email and you're trying to then ask like a government agency to verify it, right? Like, well, can you show me the image? Can you show me the video? Can you show me the document? So the question is, should you just outright share the document you are referring to? The biggest question to think about here is, where did you get the information? If you got it yourself through using a Public Information Act, or you were able to obtain it, maybe that's not as big of a concern. But if someone mailed something to you or is your source within a federal department or a government agency, you do want to think about this, especially if you're not going to be naming that source in the story, but it's more just the story is about the documents and the other people that you end up interviewing. So how can you then protect the source? By giving the document, are you basically going to potentially tell people who this person is without mentioning their name because you're giving them the document and showing it? So those are things to think about. Are you protecting the source? How can you guarantee protection and keeping them anonymous? And remember, when you're dealing with anonymous sources, I like to say, I never encourage journalists to say, like, I will guarantee no one finds out who you are. I think that's really dangerous because you really can't. You can tell them how you're going to work to protect their identity, but you never, giving a guarantee always makes me really nervous. So something else to think about is technological footprints. I'm not sure how many of you remember the Reality Winner case. This happened here. It was involved in 2017. Reality Winner was charged here in the US with removing classified material from a government facility and mailing it to a news outlet. So she provided it to The Intercept, and the material that she provided originated from the National Security Agency, so the NSA, and The Intercept published the documents unredacted. And it just so happened that the documents included printer tracking dots, which The Intercept had no idea. And because of that, the NSA was able to basically trace it back to Reality Winner, and then she was charged in this case. So if you talk to and have read it all about this case,
we had the same case here a few years back.
Okay. So I think this is a situation where for the journalist, they never wanted this to happen, right? This is not the intention, but it's, are we thinking about those questions? And did they even think that there were going to be these ink tracing? Like, no, that didn't like cross anyone's mind. So what are we thinking about as we're protecting those sources? So the question of what do you do, and I'll just share my screen really quick. It sounds like you guys have kind of dealt with this, but some questions to consider, balancing that need for transparency versus the harm that it could cause. Again, we encourage linking to original source documents, but maybe in all cases it's not true. And could you instead do an excerpt? Could you type up parts of it or take a photo of it instead of actually scanning in the actual document? One question that I get a lot, and I think is really important, if you are not going to provide the whole video or the image or the document publicly, I do not think you should be providing it to the government or other sources, because I think that sets a precedent. So for example, if police are like, well, can you show us that cell phone video that you received? Before you do that, think about, are you going to end up showing that publicly? If the answer is yes, then I think, yes, you can show them what you're going to show publicly. But I don't think you should be showing the government or other sources information for your story that you are then not going to make public, because that could set a bad precedent. Are you using a production process that will protect them? And then are there alternatives to publishing actually that document that you share? The other thing that I want to hit on really quick, and then I'll take questions, is the ethics across platforms is really, really important. We do hear a lot, oh, but it's just Twitter. We're just sharing it on Facebook. The story was only published online. It's just a photo caption. Those can still be really dangerous, and in a lot of cases can do more harm. So just remember that the foundations of ethics don't change when the delivery changes. So ethics apply no matter the medium. The same ethical standard that applies to your story and the 5 o'clock news applies to what you're sharing on Twitter and Facebook in your photo caption. There really isn't a difference between the style and the standards that exist. So that's all I have. This is just kind of a quote that I think is kind of interesting. It's easy to decide on what is wrong to wear to a party, such as a deep sea diving equipment or a pair of large pillows, but deciding what is right is much trickier. So it's easy sometimes to see like, oh, I shouldn't have done that, but what's the right thing to do can be a little bit harder. And it's up to all of us to keep on asking all of these questions about the future of what media ethics look like in a digital age and with social media. So that's all I have. So then the question is, what are some other questions that you guys may have?
I was wondering if you could speak a little about political alignment as regarding ethics. I know in the US it's a big issue.
So meaning, what exactly with that?
Fox News, ANN.
Okay, so the thought that Fox is conservative, MSNBC is liberal, is that kind of what you're?
Something like that, yes. And in the way where, let's say an outlet is, how do you say, harboring an agenda. And Fox News is very outspoken about the agenda it's putting forward, and other outlets which are considered liberal, not as such.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
So I think, something that I think journalists, this is like a conversation that's happening a lot right now here in the US with around objectivity, and that like, can you really ever be objective? That's kind of, if you look at the definition, like, can a journalist ever really be objective when we have all these things that we experience? And here in the US, it's specifically talking about like, if you are a Black journalist, how can you not say Black Lives Matters? Like you are Black, so you believe that your life matters. So how is saying that on Twitter something that's political, right? So that's kind of part of a discussion that's happening now. And I think for a long time, there was this kind of, oh, journalists are objective. And I guess I like to say, like, we try to be objective, and that our experiences we can never get rid of, and they can only make us potentially better reporters and better journalists because we have that diversity of what we've experienced in our lives. But that said, I think when we are then covering those topics, we should try to stick as much to the facts and not let our opinions and those experiences or those opinions kind of creep in. So related to politics, I would say that's the same thing. If you are going to be an organization, you're a news organization, and you really want to be the voice for more conservatives, I think you should be very open about that. I don't necessarily think that information that's being shared with that light is wrong or bad. Does it make it ethical journalism? I would question that. But I think it is information and it's fine to share. I think the biggest thing is, how can you be transparent about what you're doing? So something that I like to say also is, journalists, we actually are biased. We are biased toward facts. We are biased toward the truth. And we are, for a lot of local communities, we have a bias toward serving our community and seeing our community thrive, right? So we're going to investigate wrongdoings. We're going to cover things that celebrate what's being done right? Those might be where our biases lie. So I think if you are transparent about that, that's the key. Now, what I don't think is fair and ethical is when you have someone saying they are a news organization, yet they're leaving parts out of the news. So for example, just yesterday or 2 days ago, Fox News was reporting on Ghislaine Maxwell and her arrest, and they used a photo that showed her, Jeffrey Epstein, the First Lady, but did not show Trump. So the photo really had President Trump, the First Lady, Jeffrey Epstein, and Maxwell, all four next to each other. But when Fox News showed the image, they cropped the president out, and they were referring to Melania by using her maiden name. Like, that to me is not an accurate depiction of what was going on. Like, you made a conscious decision to edit an image to kind of change the story or change what the repercussion may be, what the conversation may be. And CNN does it too. So I think, you have kind of these situations where it's not, where I think if you look at cable news right now in the US, they're not doing a good enough job of deciphering between opinion and news in trying to say that things are news when they are not.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I'm not sure how is it working, the Zoom. Anyway, my name is Nick, and I'm wondering, you're speaking about the politics on Fox, CNN, but more broadly about all kind of stories. How common is that editors or CEOs are involving with the story that correspondent doing, because it's a friend of a friend, ideology, commercials, or some other interests, conflicts of them.
So
how
like
common is that?
So how common is it that if someone does a story, it might be because they know the person and that's why the story is getting done? Is that kind of the question?
How common is that as a correspondent on your daily work, that you are interfered with your work, with your stories, with how you are writing them because of the other interests? Like the example of Fox with Trump, but other kinds of interests that are not so political.
Yeah, so I think if I'm a correspondent for, let's say, CNN, and I am given a story and it happens to be maybe about the church that I belong to, let's just say, and maybe I am someone who's very, very involved with that church. If that's the case, I think really as the individual, you should ask yourself, do I feel that I could fairly cover this? Or am I too close and I have a vested interest in it? And maybe it's not the church. Maybe it's an environmental case. Maybe you are very involved with PETA, let's say, I don't know, animals' rights, and the story is about that. And you're assigned the story. I think it is up to you to say, okay, I don't think I should cover this because I'm too well connected. I've spoken at their annual charity gala. I've done this because there's that potential conflict. And I think you should have that conversation with your editor. And then I think, ideally, if you have involvement, then that story is assigned to someone else. If it cannot be assigned to someone else, I think it should be disclosed about what your involvement is within the story itself. Does that answer the question?
The question was about the editors, not about me. If they have some other interests, not me.
Oh, okay. So they have the interest and they're assigning the story based on those interests.
They change the stories. They change. Okay. I don't want you to interview this guy. I don't want you to say this kind of things about this company. Here it happens so much.
Yeah.
So that's
the editors, if they are doing that because of a personal belief or a personal connection, that would be a conflict on their behalf, I believe. And I think, that should be something that should be pushed back on. And is there a way to raise it to a level that is above them to talk about? And maybe one way of approaching it is, hey, well, we just had that person on, we should get more diversity. And maybe you don't, if that's an easier way to approach it. Sometimes it's how can you get to the end decision that you want without maybe making it that they're doing something wrong. So you could pose it as, is there a way, can we talk to someone else to get a different perspective? We've already spoken to them. Or can we involve another person to increase the diversity? Last time we heard from a man, let's hear from a woman this time. Whatever it may be, that could be an option. But yes, to me, that sounds like that's a conflict on behalf of the editor, and that should be something that is addressed and raised within the newsroom.
I was wondering if you have some more practical advice regarding all those, how did you say, addressing stuff in the newsroom, because it's not as simple as obviously. So.
Yes. So for me, I find, can you go back to policies that exist? So one, being familiar with what your newsroom policies are. I know for me, when I worked at NBC, when I had to do this once, it was surprising how hard it was for me to find that policy. So when you find those policies, if the number one thing you can do after this is go find the policies, save it as a PDF, save it somewhere where it's easy for you to get to. So you kind of know where they are, you know what they say, and you can then be ready to use that if you ever potentially have to to have these conversations. And if you point to those policies, I think it makes it a lot harder for the people that might be your editor or might be your boss to say, oh, well, we don't do that. And you're like, well, actually, it says that we are supposed to right here in our own policies. And so are you saying now that that policy has changed? If so, we should be updating this. So it kind of puts them it makes it harder for them to just kind of brush it off if you can stick to those policies. The other thing that can help is, can you get the backing of a union, a journalism organization, to kind of support you in that? Can you get other people in your newsroom? So maybe it's not just you that goes forward, but are there other people in a group that can come forward and have the conversation? I also really like to kind of think about it as like having a conversation and not really like accusing anyone of like avoiding conflicts. So say, I think this is something we should talk about. I've noticed in this situation, we did X. In this other situation, we did Y. It seems like we should have done the same thing in both situations. Can we have a conversation as to why that didn't happen, and maybe develop a policy moving forward? So you kind of make it as not like you did this wrong and you're pointing fingers, but it's a conversation that you want to have. Even if you know that you're right and that they shouldn't have done that and they did something wrong, it just kind of sometimes makes it easier to have that conversation. But it is really hard. I mean, and in some cases, it's going to potentially might make your job a lot harder there at that newsroom, right? I mean, they may think that sometimes, you know, you're the complainer or you're the one that's just not doing the job, right? So you do have to be kind of prepared for that. But if you think it's what's right, I think I highly recommend doing it, and know that there are others that are here to support you as you do it.
I think that altering a story is of course, one sort of pressure, and the other kind of pressure that a lot of journalists are getting is bringing the story very close to publishing, and then a story being dropped all completely and left out with no real explanation. Of course, the person doing it has a list of explanations that could be used to say that it was for professional reasons, and many times you know that it's not, and especially if it's something repeating itself or if it's something that's concerning a certain person. So that makes it very complicated in many situations.
Yeah, so I know with the Me Too movement, I mean, here in the US, we saw that a lot, where stories weren't published by one network and then were by someone else, and there are different reasons that were given. You can believe those, not believe those. I think, you know, not being involved, I don't know exactly what happened, but I think, you know, they're sometimes questionable. And so a couple things that you could do is, one, there's potentially the opportunity to see if another outlet wants it. If you're in a position that you maybe are freelance or contract and not a full-time employee, that might be more open or available. The other thing is, I know I've been in situations where for whatever reason they say, oh, you just don't have enough to publish this. So what I have done and been successful at is I try to publish it like in little pieces. So maybe it's like a series, like, okay, I say, okay, well, let me rework it. And I kind of remove maybe the part that they're not sure about yet, but the parts that they didn't have any questions about, I try to get that published. And then normally what does happen when you publish stories like that, you do tend to sometimes get more sources, more information. So maybe then that can beef up that second part that then you can publish that maybe they were questioning. So that's potentially an option too. And, you know, you always have the option to say, you know what, I believe so strongly in this, I'm going to walk away and I'm just going to publish it myself online and just hope that maybe it goes viral and someone else reports on it. And then obviously I know it's a huge risk. I mean, but we are in a time where that is a possibility.
Just one last one off topic. What do you think about the future of the journalism? How it will be? You know, it's a general question to everybody.
Yeah. I also love how I've seen like the sunset behind you, Nick. It's been very nice. Like now it's dark there though. Yeah, I think to me, when I teach classes, journalism students, I mean, I think it's an exciting time to be a journalist because I do think there are so many options, and you know, there isn't the same, like when I was going through journalism school, it was, okay, if you want to be a reporter on air, you have to do this, and then this, right? And now that's just not the case anymore. I think there are so many more opportunities and options of things that you can do on your own without having to like move from city to city or whatever it may be. So like in those cases, I think there are more opportunities to tell stories in exciting ways. I also, though, think it's really just kind of personally difficult to be a journalist right now. I experience this when I go through my Facebook feed and I see people blaming, like good friends of mine, blaming the media for COVID and saying the media is ruining my summer. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And it gets so frustrating. And I've had conversations with these friends and I don't know, that to me, like sometimes it just makes me really upset and just personally, it just hurts. So I think that's hard. But I think, you know, one way that we can overcome that is by being willing to have conversations with people about how journalism works, what our role is, explaining that, you know, hey, we are not the ones closing businesses. We are just reporting on the fact that they are closing. And we get our information from the mayor. We get our information from the health officials. And while that may seem basic, I have found that actually some people they're just not thinking that way. And so what I say is, hey, if you don't like what's happening, the election is in November. Vote for a new mayor. Vote for a new city council member. Vote for a new president. Like those are your options, and kind of talking through that can be really helpful. But I think because of the way information, I guess I'm optimistic about the opportunity and the options. And that I think if you are someone who wants to do journalism differently and not do it how it's always been done, that there are lots of opportunities to try that and potentially make money from it, versus before that wasn't really the case.
Well,
You're welcome.
I think we can wrap it up. What do you say?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, really.
Yes.
It was very clear, open, direct, created a lot, motivated a lot of thinking, and thank you everybody for participating, and thank you, Lynn, for doing that, and have a great day.
Yes, thank you. Have a good night, everyone. And if you ever, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or social media if anything comes up. I'm glad to talk one-on-one.
We'll send the contacts. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.